It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, I think I'm going to start with you this morning. I wanted to talk about the primaries that took place on Tuesday, particularly in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. Maybe as a moderate Republican, you're always looking for some good news in these kind of early indications. Did you see that kind of good news, or does the party continue to worry you?
I see some good news, and I'm continuing to be worried. I think, in fact, I think my takeaway is that both parties are coping with a similar situation, albeit from different directions, and that is that there's almost a confrontation within each party. It used to be simpler, Republicans ran against Democrats. Now Republicans are fighting with other Republicans, and Democrats fighting with other Democrats. So Trump, who I honestly I'm not even sure I can categorize him any longer as a Republican. Trump is embarked on a strategy for Trump. It has nothing to do really with the Republican Party per se. He's looking for people who will support his long ago proven false notion that the election was stolen from him. And if you're willing to go down that path, he's willing to provide political support. Pennsylvania, I'll take first because it was the most unusual, which is he seemed to stand back from it for the longest amount of time, even though he had in the gubernatorial candidate, Doug Mastriano, somebody who had been very supportive of him, but he didn't think he was supportive enough. And so he waited to, I think, the Saturday before Election Day to announce his endorsement. And that did push Mastriano, but he was already in the lead. So Trump is, applauding himself for picking a winner, but the guy was a winner even before Trump endorsed him. He was a winner, though, with very pro-Trump attitudes. The Democrats, of course, in Pennsylvania don't mind this at all because they think that Mastriano was highly defeatable, shall we say, by the Democratic challenger, who's currently state attorney general, won statewide races. And therein lies the problem. Trump pursues people who will parrot what Trump wants them to be saying about the 2020 election. There's nothing about policy here, by the way. It's all this, support for these false notions that Trump still hangs on to. And if you do that, you get the endorsement. So, but then to endorse people and to propel people who at least are going to have a tough chance, in some cases no chance, of winning in a general election is not helpful to the party. It merely continues to, somehow in some weird, strange way support Trump. North Carolina, he supported Congressman Ted Budd, and that support helped Budd in the election. He's going to face a former state Supreme Court Chief Justice, a fairly strong candidate in that race. He also supported Madison Cawthorn, this fairly unusual Republican who got himself in all kinds of trouble for his personal conduct. And that proved not to work. The voters, the Republicans went to the polls and defeated Trump's choice there. So a mixed bag, to be sure. And I really got to let Al talk about the Democrats as well. But I would say, some of the headlines are progressives did well. And they did in some cases, and they didn't in other cases. So in both of these parties are very much, I would say, almost a work in progress after decades and decades, trying to sort themselves out with factions internal to each party on multiple sides.
Al, I wanted to talk about the Democratic race in Pennsylvania because it was stunning how well that progressive candidate did. And going back to some of your concerns that the Democrats are going far too left for the American people, was that good news for you?
Well, it depends who the Republican nominee is. Whether it's good news for me or not, for the Democrats or not. But look, I guess I don't want to read a lot into the results from Tuesday. I mean, the Republican primary, we're probably not going to know the outcome until maybe early June, because it's almost sure to go to a recount. And whether McCormick, who Trump did not endorse, wins by 200 votes, or Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz wins by 1,000, Trump's endorsee, we won't know because it's going to go to a recount. To me, actually, the story of Tuesday's primary was sort of, and this will get around to answering your question, is sort of the pall that Trump really has cast over the body politic. He's affected both parties. It's not necessarily that his candidates dominate Republican races, even though they've won in a lot of places, as Craig said. But they usually win with about a third of the Republican vote when it's contested, and that's less than 15% of the national vote. So it's not that it's not the size of the vote, but he is the most important figure in their party, even though he's probably not the dominant figure that he used to be. And we'll actually get a better idea next week of his strength, because he's going to be in the first really tough contested race where he's been all in, which is David Perdue's attempt to unseat Governor Kemp in Georgia. It looks like the Kemp is going to clobber David Perdue. There are other races in Georgia as well, but the governor's race, really, if you want to test Trump's strength against a strong non-Trump Republican, that's the place to look at. But to me, the problem is this pall that he's cast over the entire body politic. And Pennsylvania is a good example. Craig mentioned the Republican nominee for governor. It was an election denier, promised to appoint a Secretary of State who would look into decertifying the 2020 election. Fortunately, in that case, the Democrats have a good moderate candidate, Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General, who is probably, at least goes into the race as the favorite, but Pennsylvania is a swing state, so you don't know. But the Senate race, which is a very important race, because that is the race that could decide whether Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell is the majority leader of the Senate. All three Republican candidates were basically wouldn't admit that Biden was the president. And that tells you something. That's Trump's, I call that the Trump pall. On the Democratic side, John Fetterman, who is the lieutenant governor, is probably more progressive than I am, even though on some issues like fracking, he's taken pretty mainstream positions. But the issue is not, but the problem is not that Fetterman is a progressive or a moderate. He was chosen basically because of his persona. He's 6'8", he's tattooed, he wears, I don't know, biker clothes and shorts in the middle of the winter to campaign. So Democrats look at that image, some of them, a lot of them, particularly progressives, who can't get their candidates elected and statewide on their ideas, and say, well, here's a guy who can really identify with working class people because of the way he works. I think that's a sad, that's not the way we should decide who our nominees are. But what it really is Trump's influence. Progressive Democrats can't win on their ideas, so they want to have a Trump-like figure who they think can, on his personality, win over working class white voters. Maybe it'll work. I hope it does. Maybe Fetterman will turn out to be really a terrific, smart senator. He certainly is well educated, he ran a very good campaign. But, I sort of see him as, sort of a Jesse Ventura type running in the Democratic Party. But the problem with all this is nobody's talking about the issues that we face, and this country faces so many important issues. The Republicans are all looking back to 2020, and the Democrats are looking to see how they can find a macho man who will match Trump on the television screen.
Well, I was going to bring that up, Craig, and there are some isolated cases where the non-deniers did okay, but it seems to be an ongoing narrative in most of these Republican primaries about where people stand on 2020, but more importantly, what policies they would bring to the table if they won to impact how America or those states will vote.
It is a problem. I think that those who are the non-deniers of the 2020 election outcome spent a lot of time running on issues, and that worked well for them, those that won. And hopefully people will take note from that. I think Al's point about these contested primaries on the Republican side with multiple candidates, and then one who Trump lands on, driving that person into the 30% range is very important to acknowledge. And we've always said, and I've always thought, that there is a strong Trump faction in the Republican Party, but it is not the whole Republican Party. And so, that's where we end up with that. I think the other thing that is so troubling, I just think Trump is a one-man wrecking machine. And now he's out in this contest, which is too close to call, with Dr. Oz, telling Dr. Oz he should just announce he won because there's something wrong with the election process in Pennsylvania. Well, our viewers should know that actually there's nothing wrong with it. It's the law. The law says that mail-in ballots aren't counted until election day. So ballots from service members overseas and people who mailed in their ballots, it's going to take some time to count them. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way Pennsylvania does it. That's the way they want to do it. And in this close race, it's going to be weeks, a week or 2 weeks, something before we know the outcome. But again, Trump is out there suggesting that this is wrong and a candidate should certainly just declare himself as the winner even before all the votes are counted. And Al calls him the most important factor. He's the most disruptive factor in the Republican Party and probably in the body politic, that's for sure. And I think this race, I agree with you, in the coming attractions category, I would say this race in Georgia is one to watch. There's some of the polling suggests that Kemp not only will stand up to the Trump-backed challenger, but that the Governor Brian Kemp may well actually not even have to go into a runoff. He's that far ahead. So whether Trump, who is all in, as Al says, whether he can change those numbers in the closing days or not will be very interesting to watch, and a good indicator of just where this may go from here.
Al, you have the last word.
Well, I guess these primaries in Georgia next week, and eventually we'll have a Republican nominee here in Pennsylvania from this week's election. They'll give us some indication of what's going to happen, but the real test for really both parties and for Trump in particular is going to be in the general election. And this is a year that Republicans should do very well. And we'll see if nominating, candidates in Trump's mold in a lot of these states where, just take Pennsylvania and Georgia, for example. In Georgia, the Trump candidate is the football star Herschel Walker. Now, he's a great football player, but he's got a pretty troubled background in a lot of ways with domestic abuse, and which he, tries not to talk about in a and probably gets away with it in the primaries in general against Reverend Warnock, Senator Warnock. He's not going to be so easy. And that's a seat that the Republicans should win if they had a good candidate. But the Trump candidate may cost them that seat. Pennsylvania's another case. If Dr. Oz wins, I mean, it really probably doesn't matter who wins, but particularly if Dr. Oz wins, he's a carpetbagger. He had really very little connection with Pennsylvania. And he basically is running, as Trump, as a celebrity. I hope John Fetterman turns out to be a very strong candidate, even though there's some things in his background too. A couple of incidents when he was mayor that didn't come up in the primaries, that will come up in the general election. But that's a case where Trump's candidate could cost the Republicans a victory that they should again win. And let's look at Ohio, where J.D. Vance is the candidate, the Trump-backed candidate. Now, Ohio has been leaning Republican, but as we learned with Todd Akin in Missouri several years ago, if you put a bad enough candidate up, even in a leaning state, a state that leans your way, you could lose. And Democrats happen to have a great candidate in Tim Ryan. In an ordinary year, somebody like Tim Ryan would have a very hard time winning. But maybe against J.D. Vance and Trump craziness, he could just eke it out. So I think that's going to be the test. So I think, we'll talk about the primaries, and there'll be some interesting things, particularly next week in Georgia. But in the end, the question is, are the candidates that the Republicans nominate because of Trump's influence going to undermine their chance to take full advantage of a year that really should go their way?
Well, we have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.